go through the questions. We're not going to open up for any new questions. And Bill mentioned we had so many that perhaps in the future we'll invite you back again for phase 2 of the conversation. So
wait to see how we do this time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, just have fun. I've learned in the world of IT. I come from IT background, and of course my system is not working, and I'm in that field. When all goes wrong, use sense of humor and relax and just go with the flow.
Right.
So,
all right.
Well, we got a lot of, we came up with some questions, but Yangyang and Jeff, registrants were asked to give questions when they registered, and we got some very interesting questions, which we'll integrate into here. But some of them expose quite a lot of knowledge about what's going on, which is great. And now we have an extra added attraction. We have our U.S. commercial service. We're given the opportunity to join the webinar, but they can't because the U.S. government cannot use Zoom. So they actually have a call-in number and an ID they were given. So we have some of them going to be calling on also actually from more than one country, but they can only call in and listen. They can't participate in the full Zoom because of security issues with Zoom. Was it
just the video aspect of it, or was it also security in terms of the audio?
Apparently they can call in.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I know there's some issues with Zoom. So, but since we're an open event, I assume it'll be all right.
We'll give it a couple more minutes and then we'll get started if that's okay with Serge. There's Serge. He's back.
Yeah, I'm back. I just put on Nora. Since we're going to be starting in just a few minutes, do you have the who starts? Are you starting first?
No, you are, Serge.
I'm starting first. Okay, because I have not seen. Was an agenda sent? I didn't see it.
Yeah, Medina. Are you online?
Did you get the my intro?
I got your intro. I got your bio.
And that's all you have to do. Just introduce me and then I'll go with it. That's all.
Okay, I got it. I wasn't sure if Nora was going to say something initially. Okay.
I know I had asked Medina to do a welcome, but
she's going to do it at the end. So.
Yeah, I'll do the thank you at the end, but Medina is supposed.
Okay, Serge, we're getting up there in numbers. Why don't you go ahead and start?
Are we there? Okay, very good, Bill. Good to see everybody. Let's go. All right. Welcome, everybody, to the World Affairs Council of Orange County. We're excited to present our second webinar in a series of many webinars we're going to have over the next couple of months. In this I think, very dynamic, very interesting topic is the Tiananmen protests of 1989 to the Hong Kong crisis of 2019 and beyond. And absent the recent news items here happening domestically, China has been on the radar for quite some time. And so we have a very distinguished panel, and we have our own Bill Edwards as the moderator. So I'm going to introduce Bill, and he will introduce our two distinguished speakers who are experts, along with Bill, on the issue of Hong Kong, the future of Hong Kong, and China. Bill Edwards lived and worked in Hong Kong and China in the 1980s and has continued to do business in both for the past 38 years. Having lived in 7 countries and worked on projects in over 50 countries, he founded Edwards Global Services, and you may sometimes see his emails. In 2001, he formed the company and he took the US Brands Global, and he could tell you some of the companies he's taken global. EGS, his company, has twice received the US Presidential Award for Export Excellence. And we can always use more exports and less imports, right, Bill?
Yes, sir.
The US Secretary of Commerce has twice appointed Mr. Edwards to the District Export Council, DEC, DEC, of Southern California. He is, of course, a trustee and a member of the board of directors of the World Affairs Council of Orange County. So I'd like to welcome Bill Edwards, and Bill, introduce our guest. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Serge. Serge is the past chairman of our World Affairs Council and the current program committee chairman. We have a very timely subject today. It's gotten timely. Every day it gets more timely, it seems like. So it's really from the Tiananmen protest of 1989 to the Hong Kong crisis of 2020 and beyond, as it turns out. Our panelists today are Professor Jeff Wasserstrom and Dr. Yangyang Cheng. Professor Jeff Wasserstrom grew up in Santa Monica and is currently the Chancellor's Professor of History at our own University of California, Irvine. He's the author of a book recently called Vigil, Hong Kong on the Brink, and I'm going to just put it up there so you can see it. It's a great book. I can't do this correctly. I've been through it at great length, and its history is incredible about Hong Kong and sets the stage for why things are the way they are today. Jeff has traveled to East Asia regularly since 1986 and is a frequent contributor to the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, Atlantic Magazine, and Time Magazine. Jeff was at the June 4 Tiananmen protest event last year, I believe, at which I think there were 180,000 people attended at that. It's different this year. Dr. Yangyang Cheng is a postdoctoral research associate at Cornell University. She's visiting with us today from Chicago. She was born and raised in China and received her PhD in physics from the University of Chicago and her Bachelor of Science from the University of Science and Technology of China's School for the Gifted Young. Recently, Dr. Cheng has published articles on her lively communication with her mother back in China, especially in the New York Times. And I urge you to research her online and read those articles. It's a very interesting conversation she has with her mother, who wants her to come home because it's safer there. But anyway, I thank you to all our attendees who sent in many good questions, and we'll cover as many of those as we can. A little background: in 1997, China and the UK signed an agreement returning Hong Kong to China after more than 100 years of British control. The agreement was for 50 years, till 2047. And during that time, Hong Kong would be under one country, but two-system rule, with the rule of law in Hong Kong being that of the British system. Jeff, I'd like you to briefly review the June 4th, 1989 Tiananmen event and its impact on China and Hong Kong, and give your view of Hong Kong today and going forward.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be doing this event, and thanks for that opening. So in 1989, there were a series of protests in cities across China. The biggest gatherings were at Tiananmen Square in the center of Beijing. So this is something we can relate to, I think, to talk about right now with protesters across a country, but a lot of the focus being what's happening in the capital. The protests then, there was at the same time that protests were going on in Eastern Europe at the same year. And in Eastern Europe, the goal was to do away with Communist Party rule. In China, the focus was much more on just getting the Chinese Communist Party to live up to its own promises. And there was a sense that there was a division within the Communist Party leadership between people who thought that reform should go further and faster, and ones that thought that they should slow down. And that was part of what allowed the opening for the protests to take place. The protesters were angered over corruption. They felt that people with close ties to those in powers maximized, it was too easy for them to get rich and too easy for them to have special privileges. Again, something we can relate to that's not unique to the Chinese system by any means, and that it leads to discontent. There were a variety of other things that disturbed people, but basically it was largely young people who wanted to have more freedoms in a broad sense. So they talked about democracy, but they also talked about personal freedoms. They wanted to have more control over how they spent their private time, and they wanted to be more in touch with global youth culture. And I think this is important because when the movement was crushed on June 4th, 1989, a massacre by state troops in the center of Beijing, not on Tiananmen Square, but near there. And some of the people killed were students, but many were workers and ordinary bystanders. During the period after that, the Chinese Communist Party decided they didn't want to have to face this again. And so they came up with a new kind of strategy, which they tried to give people some of the freedoms in their private life without giving them political freedoms. And this has been kind of the deal that's been made since then, is that they'll try to improve people's day-to-day life in various ways, but keep a tight hold on the political system. Now in Hong Kong, there was a lot of interest in the protests in 1989. At that point, Hong Kong was still a British colony, but the deal had already been in the works that in 1997, it would become part of the People's Republic of China. So people in Hong Kong were very passionate about supporting the protesters in Tiananmen Square, and they sent them supplies, they raised money for them, and they held big solidarity protests. Because what they knew was that their future was on the line in what was happening in Beijing, that if the Chinese Communist Party loosened up, became more liberalized, they would join a country moving toward democratization. But if not, they would have to join a very authoritarian state. So there were big protests in Hong Kong in support of the protests in Tiananmen while they were going on, and then a big rally to show anger at the massacre that had taken place there. And then for the last 31 years since then, there's essentially been no possibility to hold any group gathering on the mainland that refers back to the massacre and to the protests of 1989. Discussion of that has been squelched. An effort has been made by the government to get people to forget about that. In Hong Kong, meanwhile, there have been vigils, candlelight vigils every year since then. And these happened while Hong Kong was still under British control, and they continued to happen after Hong Kong became part of the People's Republic of China. And they were an important symbol of how Hong Kong was a separate system. You could say and do things in Hong Kong that you couldn't do on the mainland. That was supposed to be the deal after 1997. And to a certain extent, Beijing and the local authorities lived up to that deal. You could hold a protest, a vigil in Victoria Park, one of the main parks in Hong Kong, where you could talk about subjects that were taboo on the mainland. There were many other things you could do similarly that are taboo on the mainland. Newspapers can publish articles about that. The newspapers will be silent on it in the mainland, across the mainland at this time. Macau, another former colony of that one case of Portugal, that was also brought in under this one country, two systems idea, has been able to hold vigils as well. They hold smaller ones, but they still hold them. So this year, it's been a real tense moment in part because the screws have been tightening on Hong Kong. And one symbol of this is that the government refused to give permission for a protest to be held, a vigil this year in Hong Kong. The reason given was COVID-19 and that there could not be any gatherings of more than 8 people. But this is at a time when Hong Kong largely has the pandemic under control. Religious services have begun again, schools have begun again. So it really seemed that they were just using that as an excuse. And in Macau, where it's really under control, they also banned the vigil, and they banned a showing of a photograph exhibit that showed the Tank Man and other images associated with 1989. So there's a lot more to the story, but that's just a little bit of the background of why the Tiananmen protests of 1989 and the Hong Kong crisis of 2019 and beyond are interconnected. And today, this evening in Hong Kong, they're ahead of us in time. People turned out even though the protest had not been authorized. They turned out at Victoria Park and held a vigil anyway, largely social distancing, largely keeping the groups separated from each other of about 8. And the police were fairly restrained, though there was some police action in other parts of Hong Kong where there were other protests. So I'll leave that there for now. As just
okay, thank you, Jeff. Dr. Cheng, your view is unique. You grew up in the mainland China and have lived now in the US for several years. From your perspective, please comment on the recent events in Hong Kong and US-China relations as a result.
This is a broad big question. So I'll talk about it this way. So I was born in mainland China in the provincial city after the bloodshed in Tiananmen. And for the 19 years I've lived in China, I did not know what happened. I had a vague idea of something huge and something tragic and something forbidden. I got the sense of that by just observing the blurry contours of censorship. But I did only get to find out the truth about Tiananmen and read the documents about it after I came to the US in 2009. In particular, I learned about Tank Man from a classmate of mine at the University of Chicago who's from New Hampshire. And so I think that is something that I acknowledge, that there is a part of the history that my country has denied me. And that censorship is effective in a sense by blocking out this information, though it's not a complete unawareness. I think because of how effective and how crude the way the Chinese government has censored the events of Tiananmen and the bloody nature of the event itself, and how it is seen on world screens across the world, and how it can be openly discussed outside of China for the past 31 years, it has created this dichotomy that in some way the legacy of Tiananmen has been somewhat flattened or symbolized or essentialized. And essentialization, there are two aspects of it. One, first, it's essentialized as it's something uniquely Chinese, that the Chinese Communist Party is uniquely brutal, and it's doing this. And I think that is a disservice to the legacy, because it was something that the Chinese government did, but it's not something that could not happen elsewhere, as what we've seen in Eastern Europe around the same time as what we've seen in this country over the past week. And the second thing is how the essentialization of the legacy of Tiananmen is how it is uniquely violent and uniquely brutal, which is true to a certain extent of over 200,000 regular troops in regular battleground formation, basically as an occupying force to take over the capital of a city, the capital of a country, territory it already hold. But I think there is, when we have these discussions over the protests in Hong Kong, or even the protests that are happening in this country right now, there is this looming question was just like, oh, would this become another Tiananmen, or would Tiananmen happen again? And so there is almost an anticipation of violence, as if this kind of extraordinary violence would be able to prove something. And I think that is a misunderstanding of the nature of state violence, that the greatest violence happens not necessarily with tanks on the streets or machine guns pointed at crowds, but in these like insidious ways, in sporadic ways, in ways of erasing memory, censoring information. Is also a form of violence. And so I think a lot of times when the discussions of Tiananmen are happening outside of China, say here in the United States, we see certain politicians might be trying to take a stand and stick it to the Chinese Communist Party by touting the legacy of Tiananmen to commemorate the martyrs. On the other hand, they might be using very antagonistic, aggressive rhetoric towards similar demands for equality, justice, and freedom in their own country. And so, which brings us to the topic of Hong Kong. When we saw the protests in Hong Kong last year, and there were a lot of Hong Kong protesters, including protest leaders, who were looking to the United States, and there were also US politicians who used Hong Kong as somehow their personal stage to stand with the protesters as a way to burnish their human rights record. And I wouldn't mention any particular lawmaker by name, but they have horrific human rights records in their own countries, in their own states and districts. And so I think this brings us to the partly the essence of the conundrum that is facing Hong Kong, that is both its challenge and, to paraphrase a line from the US-based Hong Kong writer Winfrey Chan, it's also Hong Kong's emancipatory potential. That the future of Hong Kong shouldn't just be like a geopolitical football between empires. It shouldn't, the fate of Hong Kong shouldn't just serve global capital as how the city was created and developed, but it should serve the people and serve actual humanist values. And I think in that sense, when we have these discussions with the current protests in Hong Kong and how the legacy of Tiananmen pulses through that, it's also a way for us to challenge the limit of our understandings of Chinese identity, of the idea of a state itself, our moral and political imagination.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I appreciate that. I think maybe, Jeff, it might be a good idea if you just gave us a brief summary of what's caused the recent problems and that have brought things sort of to the head.
Sure. So in Hong Kong itself, there are a variety of things I was saying before that flag the fact that it's a different place than the mainland, that there are two systems. The idea of one country, two systems was you're part of a country, but things can be done differently there. And there are varieties of ways in which you can think about this operating. I haven't seen this before and I haven't really thought it through, but the sort of simplest way would be, say, when there was the British Commonwealth, when you had places like Canada or Australia that still had the Queen's picture on the money, but yet in political terms, they could really make their own decisions. In a certain way in Hong Kong, one vision of how one country, two systems would work is that Hong Kong people would be able to select their own leaders, but with certain kinds of symbolic things about they would be part of this larger People's Republic of China nation. And the last time that I think it really worked that way for people there, and people in Hong Kong felt being part of the country really works for us, even, and yet we have our own system, was in 2008 when the Beijing Olympics were held. The Olympics were held in Beijing. They were the first Chinese Olympics. There was a lot of pride of people of Chinese descent around the world, including in Hong Kong. And one thing that Beijing did was allow some of the events to be held in Hong Kong. The equestrian events were held there. Hong Kong has a strong tradition of horse racing and horsemanship. So you had this thing where it was great to be part of a country. You could identify with this sort of ability to be part of this larger entity, and yet you were able to control your own fate. And one of the symbols in 2008 that people were able to control their own fate was that in 2003, there had been a call for Hong Kong to develop new anti-sedition laws. And there was a debate by the Hong Kong government to bring in anti-sedition laws that were not all that different from, say, the Patriot Act, but they would police behavior. And people got very upset about that, and they held a large protest. And the government backed down. The government said, well, there's so much popular discontent with this, we'll put this on hold, because there was fear that it would be the start of a tighter and tighter control on freedom of speech and press and assembly that people in Hong Kong really valued. So in 2008, which wasn't that long ago, 12 years ago, there was a sense that, okay, this is, from Hong Kong points of view, the one country, two systems things works. We're part of this one country in ways that benefit us, but we also clearly have our own system. In the last 6 or 7 years, it's been a steady sense in Hong Kong that the one country side of things is getting too much emphasis and the two systems part is getting weaker and weaker. One thing that's always been weak about the two systems is the idea was that Hong Kong people who had been colonized by Britain, and the head of the Hong Kong government had been somebody London appointed, they would get to choose their own leaders after 1997. So there's a chief executive chosen in Hong Kong, but only less than 2,000 people in a city of more than 7 million get to vote for that chief executive. So there was a way in which the chief executive seemed to be trying to appease Beijing more than really look out for local interests. So 6 years ago, there was a protest movement to try to get there to be more true elections to select the chief executive. There was a hated chief executive, and so the idea was next time, let's have real elections. And there was a very daring movement that went on for more than 2 months called the Umbrella Movement. That was a sit-in, occupy in 3 different zones in Hong Kong. It captured a lot of media attention for a time. The police used tear gas to try to get peaceful protesters off the streets. That brought tons of ordinary people onto the streets to support the original protesters. But the movement ended up failing. It did not change the way the chief executive was selected. The next chief executive was also chosen, handpicked in a way that would be subservient to Beijing. And since then, there have just been a variety of things that have seemed to be creeping in control, where it seems that Beijing is determined to call the shots in Hong Kong. There were a lot of small symbols of this. Bookstores that used to sell books that would challenge the Chinese Communist Party used to be another thing you knew you could do in Hong Kong that you couldn't do other parts of the PRC, was to buy those books. Several booksellers who were involved with those books were kidnapped and taken across the border and forced to make televised confessions, and in one case is still imprisoned years later. That had a chilling effect in Hong Kong. There was a train station opened, a high-speed train that went from the mainland into Hong Kong. And when you get off the train, instead of the security being controlled by Hong Kong's security forces, it's controlled by mainland ones. And that seemed to be another sign that in the long run, Beijing was going to try to make it just one country, one system. People in Hong Kong began to say it's only like one country, 1.8 systems, 1.6 systems, 1.5 systems. And so then last year, there was a move that people really felt was the beginning of the end of the rule of law and of separateness in Hong Kong, when a bill was put forward that would allow easy extradition to the mainland of anybody that Beijing wanted to have tried on the mainland rather than in Hong Kong, like people who published books that were banned on the mainland or took them across the border. And so there were first a small set of protests against this. The police used force to put down the protests. There was a small amount of vandalism, but there was a large amount of police brutality, and that brought tons and tons of more people out onto the streets. And the chief executive refused to apologize or walk back the bill initially, the way it had happened before. So more and more people started turning out on the streets. The biggest demand of the protesters became for an independent investigation of the police behavior, because police had used a lot of tear gas, and not just tear gas in open spaces, but tear gas in closed spaces like malls where there were protests and subway stations. And this is a violation of procedures that police tend to use around the world. So the movement went on and on. It ended up with 5 different demands, and the protesters said, until we get all those demands, we're going to stay on the streets. The chief executive refused to budge, refused to apologize. The expectation, there were more acts of violence by the protesters, in some cases, throwing Molotov cocktails, vandalism. Very, very rarely did they hurt any people. Usually it was buildings. At the same time, the police, though there wasn't a massacre, though there weren't, they shot a lot of rubber bullets. They used a lot of tear gas. People were beaten up by thugs, and the police turned the other way. The movement went on, and it became the longest sustained social movement and biggest sustained social movement anywhere in China since Tiananmen. And it lasted much longer than that. And that was still going on through 2019. And then it began to peter out, and there also was the pandemic that made people fearful of taking to the streets. But again, it actually didn't do away with anger at the local government, because the local government, even with the pandemic, seemed to be listening only to Beijing rather than listening to local people and to Beijing, which was how one country, 2 systems was supposed to work. And then recently there were arrests of even some of the most moderate and respected senior figures in the democracy movement, people who were very far removed from the kind of militant activists. And that's angered people more and made them feel continually that this is a kind of last stand. And now Beijing has revived the national security law, that anti-sedition law that was tabled in 2003. That was supposed to be something that Hong Kong's government was supposed to decide the contours of. And Beijing just said, we're just tired of this. We're going to bring it in. And that's really given people a sense that the writing's on the wall, that there really isn't anything much left of one country, 2 systems. Beijing would like it to be that the 2 systems part just means economically things work a little differently. Their view of how it could work well, Macau, where there isn't much political unrest, but there are casinos and gambling. So there's a different economic structure, but not a different political structure. And now the sense in Hong Kong is there's a kind of last ditch fight to preserve any kind of freedom of speech or freedom of assembly. And the mood there is very complicated. There's both a lot of desperation and a lot of determination to show that even though it's riskier now to take part in protests, that people aren't going to just accept this, this simply. And it happens in clear-cut ways and also in kind of subtle cultural ways. There was a satiric show in Hong Kong called Headliner that would make fun of the British authorities before 1997 and would make fun of the Communist Party after 1997. It's a bit like the Hong Kong equivalent of Saturday Night Live. And the Hong Kong government wished it would go away. The Communist Party wished it would go away, the same way that authority figures in this country, when they're made fun of by satirists, wish the satirists would stop, but the satire doesn't stop. But that show was just axed. So you have people in Hong Kong feeling that the things that they look to say, this is how I know I'm in a place that has more freedom than the authoritarian state across the border, those are being chipped away at. And it's making people wonder if to have the kind of life that they like, that they've grown accustomed to, that they think is how the place they care about is, if they'll have to think about leaving. But then others are so attached to Hong Kong that they don't want to think about leaving. So it's a very tense and fraught moment.
So, thank you, Jeff. As a result of that, the U.S. government has said that the special situation between Hong Kong and the U.S., as far as tariffs and laws and that sort of thing, will probably go away. And at the same time, Boris Johnson in the UK has said he's offering, potentially offering British citizenship to 3 million Hong Kongers. And of course, the Central Chinese Party, Communist Party, doesn't really like any of that, and they're lashing out about that. Yangyang, what do the people of China think about all this, of mainland China? I know I've read what your mother thinks, but what do you do in your articles? But what do they think of us, of all of this going on by the foreigners?
I think this is a tricky question, right? Very broadly speaking.
What wasn't meant to be a trick question?
No, I didn't mean it's a trick question. Okay. I meant it's a question to answer as a scholar and also as a Chinese person myself, right? Because when we think broadly about public opinion in China, we don't have a particularly good sense from an academic standpoint, because we cannot do any like real scholarly academic polls because of the censorship and because of the real political risk involved. And China is a big country with a diverse population, and people anywhere, they are different. They have different views, and there is not like a singular Chinese opinion towards Hong Kong. But because of these two difficulties in getting an idea of just public opinion in China, it also feeds this kind of bias from outside of China, thinking that Chinese people, because they live in an authoritarian state with such strict state censorship, they're all like puppets who are brainwashed and don't have ability to think for themselves. But that's actually that's also not true. Chinese people are not that different from American people or people anywhere in their immediate concerns in terms of having a better life for themselves and for their families, for their children. And so in that sense, that connects to how people from the mainland may view Hong Kong. And I would speak, it's again shaded by my own upbringing and by the limitations of my own experience. But if you think about it, when Hong Kong, when I was growing, especially for people who didn't grow up in first tier cities, which is the vast majority of China, including myself, Hong Kong was a place that is a world away, and it has enjoyed a level of material abundance and cultural abundance that we couldn't imagine in the 90s or even in the early 2000s. And so it has, and even after the handover, Hong Kong, the people of Hong Kong enjoy certain like privileges in terms of their ability to travel with a Hong Kong passport, in terms of the level of protection that they have in Hong Kong with an independent judiciary, or even just very basic things like food safety and air quality, etc. And so it creates a sense of, and people on the mainland are also people. So they would look to Hong Kong. There is an internalized inferiority complex. There is an internalized envy, but there is also a sense of thinking the people of Hong Kong are this spoiled child that has come back home and enjoyed all these privileges, but they don't necessarily recognize how good they have it. While on the side of Hong Kong, when they look at the mainland, they don't see it in the same way. On one hand, I acknowledge there is a sense of superiority among a lot of people in Hong Kong when they look at the mainland as well. And that has a cultural and social economic basis to it. But there are also a sense of when they look at the mainland, they don't necessarily see their compatriots, especially as the Chinese government becomes more authoritarian and tries to curb the civil liberties and other types of freedoms that people of Hong Kong have been able to enjoy even under British colonial rule. They see that Hong Kong is a former British colony that is being recolonized by the People's Republic of China. And so in that context, the people of Hong Kong could see the people from the mainland as potential settlers, as colonizers, or as members of a colonial power. And so there is this real dichotomy there, and there is this tension, which I feel it's very human, it's very understandable, but it's also very unfortunate. And if we connect back to the topic of Tiananmen, if we think about in May, right, when when there is such sense of solidarity among the Chinese diaspora for people in Hong Kong, in Macau, in Taiwan, even overseas, and how they saw the struggle of Chinese students and workers as part of their own struggle. And how that, and then last night I saw this tweet from a Hong Kong lawyer, Vincent Wong, who's based in Canada. He said that 10 years ago when he participated in a vigil for Tiananmen in Hong Kong, that was the first time when he felt affirmed in both his Hong Kong identity and his Chinese identity. And so I think in this moment, we need to rethink this, that on one hand, to acknowledge these real life conditions, socioeconomic, political, and cultural, that has led to these divisions, and to not demonize anybody on any side of the spectrum. But on the other hand, recognize the shared yearnings of Chinese people, or just people anywhere, and really build a movement of solidarity rather than division.
Well, it's just not a simple situation. It's just very complicated. Thank you. Jeff, in a very recent American Chamber of Commerce survey in Hong Kong, U.S. businesses were asked whether they would, with all the things that are happening and the concerns about security and fairness, whether they would stay in Hong Kong. And 70% said they would, but 30% said they're planning to move. That's a gigantic change in the business climate. I guess the question is, it looks like Hong Kong will be less of a place for businesses to base themselves on a regional basis. What's your take on that?
So when I was in Hong Kong in December, and I usually don't spend that much time, frankly, hanging out with business people, but I did go to a breakfast that was specifically with business people, and I was curious about this exact same question. And one of the interesting answer I got from one person, and things hadn't deteriorated as much then, but he said that the thing to watch isn't really who's going to leave, but to look at that matters, but also look at who's trying to decide where to base your operations. If you're going to start increasing your presence in Asia, where would you pick? And Hong Kong, he said, just isn't looking that attractive anymore as a place to pick. So if you're trying to decide, a company that 5 years ago, 10 years ago might have picked Hong Kong, now will be saying, well, what about Taipei, or what about Singapore, in different ways? And possibly even, what about Shenzhen? If cities across the border aren't that different and I can get a better deal there, well, why not just consider that? So the variety of ways. One of the reasons why Hong Kong was protected, why these kinds of freedoms were allowed to go on as long as they were, because Communist Party rulers are never that comfortable with a press that criticizes them and things like that, was precisely because they thought initially they really needed to have Hong Kong preserved in its economic role when it became part of China. The idea was it was a golden goose, and that you don't kill the goose that lays the golden egg. Chris Patten, the last colonial governor of Hong Kong, now Lord Patten in England, he's got very good lines. I quote him in the book, and he gives one of the best lines that I have there. But another line that he didn't say to me was, he said, the golden goose theory is fine, except history is littered with the corpses of decapitated geese. But it's just that when push came to shove, that would only protect you so far. And I think that's part of the story. And part of the thing is that China, the Communist Party, doesn't depend on Hong Kong nearly as much economically. The percentage of the PRC's GDP that's Hong Kong is much less significant than it was before. It's still an important place to have operating differently. It's good for Beijing to have Macau, where gambling can take place and other things take place that they can kind of protect from happening on the mainland, but can happen there. It's good for Beijing to have Hong Kong be able to attract some businesses that can operate there, but not on the mainland. So it's not that it's become insignificant, but it's not as significant economically. And it's true that there are companies, it's not just that companies are saying they'll stay, but there are some companies, international companies, that have come out with high profile statements, pressured perhaps, but because they want to move forward, saying they're not bothered by the idea that there'll be a new national security law coming in from Beijing. Beijing is claiming it won't really make that much difference to most people in Hong Kong. If you're not engaged in militant protests, you don't have anything to worry about. The problem is that it'll be anti-sedition laws a lot like what there are on the mainland, and people know that on the mainland there have been people who've been charged for sedition simply for doing very kind of simple things, like posting something on social media saying that they like the Dalai Lama. Beijing considers the Dalai Lama a vicious separatist figure, so that suddenly becomes sedition. So I think there's a kind of division within the business community and other communities that, yes, in many ways, many things about Hong Kong potentially will go along as they were before. It'll still be a place where it's very enjoyable if you have money to spend to live a certain kind of way. It's a really fun city with some beautiful nature, connected with very cosmopolitan urban life. It's an amazing setting. The problem is just how much it chafes at you to have control over you. Singapore is a place that has a fair degree of authoritarian control, and yet has a lot of enjoyable things about its lifestyle. So one vision is that it may become, it has become more like that, and maybe that will keep happening. And some businesses are perfectly happy to operate in Singapore. I know that universities in these different places are concerned for quite specific things about degrees of academic freedom and things like that. It's really touch and go. Again, I think it's partly about who will leave, but it's also partly about who will make a different decision about going there. I haven't heard of a lot of academics who are planning to leave because of this tightening of controls. But I do know of some people who had tenure track jobs in the West and got a good offer from Hong Kong and thought, why not? It's, I can have the same kind of life there. And now I think they would think twice in this kind of setting. Although there are concerns in the West too right now. So it's a complicated dynamic.
Well, that's good feedback. We've got one question that says there's about 85,000 Americans living in Hong Kong. Do you think they'll repatriate or stay in Hong Kong? And I think you've given the answer there. I can tell you personally, it's a great place to live, and it's a great place to do business into Hong Kong, into China from Hong Kong. Yangyang, you and I had a conversation before about the movement of Chinese people back and forth from the mainland to China, and there's a lot through Shenzhen, through the high-speed train system now into Hong Kong. Do you think, in light of all this, that there'll continue to be a somewhat free movement of people between between Hong Kong and China, mainland China?
I think this is a really interesting question, because I think one thing that people need to acknowledge is there isn't really very free movement of people inside China on the mainland. Right? We have the hukou system, the residential permit system. And so freedom of movement is not just about being physically able to go from one place to another. It's also about whether or not you're able to buy property, whether you're able to find jobs, whether or not you're able to send your kids to school. And there is a lot of restrictions on that just in the mainland between the provinces, in particular for ethnic minorities like Uyghurs or Tibetans, but also for the rural population going to the urban areas. And there has been all these discussions about, and for people going from second or third tier cities like my hometown going to Beijing or Shanghai, these movements are very much constrained. And it's constrained that there's a hindrance to economic development, but the Chinese government does so because it is for social and political control. And so when we think about whether or not there would be relatively free movement between the mainland and Hong Kong down the road, I think for the people who have the resources to travel, they will continue to be able to travel for business, for work, etc. But the people, but that's very privileged people. And so I think that's also the discussion we need to have in thinking about the future of Hong Kong and the future of China in general, is whom are the communities we are most focused on when we are talking about a lot of people like the British government saying people holding the British overseas passport, British national overseas passports can emigrate. Only people with resources can emigrate, and being forced to emigrate is a huge loss, right? Not being able to, not on one's own terms, to leave a homeland, it's a huge loss. And I say that as something personal to me, as someone who left mainland China with no certain prospect of return. And so these are the things we need to think about, right? In Hong Kong, it's not just academics and business leaders. There are domestic workers, also not of Chinese ethnicity, but from Southern Asian countries. And there are workers who live there, who live in very dire situations. Like Hong Kong is one of the most unequal places in the world, socioeconomically speaking. And so what would be their future with a tightening political climate? And always the most vulnerable population are the ones who bear the brunt of that. And they should be the ones that we center our discussions on, whether or not it's with regards to movement of people, or with regards to the curbing of political freedom, or the future of economic development.
That's a really good and all-encompassing conversation about movement of people into China. Those of us who've been to China realize it's a gigantic country with very diverse regions, and movement is not always. Not everybody can take the high-speed train from Beijing to Hong Kong. Jeff, what's your prediction for the next Legislative Council election coming up in September? That seems to be a very sensitive subject with the mainland.
Yeah, the elections. So first of all, I'll say any predictive question, I begin with answering with Hong Kong by saying Hong Kong has a long tradition of making fools of forecasters. From 1841 on, the foreign secretary, when Britain beat the Cheng Empire in the Opium War, and the negotiator on the British side got Hong Kong secured as a colony, future colony for Britain, he basically got fired because the foreign secretary said this was a pathetic place to get as a victor's prize. It had no potential to be a great mart of trade. He was saying it would never be as good as Macau or Canton nearby. And he was wrong, because Hong Kong became a great mart of trade. And since then, before 1997, the handover, there were people who predicted that as soon as the handover happened, all freedom of press, all separation of the legal system would disappear. And it didn't. And then there were people who predicted everything would be fine for decades, the full 50 years guaranteed, and it hasn't been. So all predictions are problematic. Last fall, there was a lot of, when the protests were getting very intense, there was a lot of focus on district elections, low-level elections. And there were activists who said, let's focus on that. Let's focus on using the limited kind of democracy we have to really try to tip the balance in favor of the things we want. And some people were skeptical that the government was growing so impatient with the protests, maybe they wouldn't even allow those elections to take place. And maybe it wouldn't have that much of a difference if they did. Those predictions were wrong. The elections took place and the pro-democratic groups won by a landslide. Now, a more significant set of elections are coming up for the Legislative Council that really gets to make more of the laws. But the deck is stacked in the Legislative Council. There are a certain number of seats that are set aside largely for people who are pro-government. And once again, we're in the same situation. There's a lot of effort within the pro-democracy camp, a split between people who say the only thing that gets anything done is street action, people who say, let's focus on the elections and try to change things there. There's worry that Beijing periodically just gets impatient with Hong Kong, that maybe they won't allow those elections to take place, or maybe they'll disqualify so many people from standing in the elections by using these new laws that it won't be a fair fight at all. So it's definitely going to be the next thing to watch coming up in the fall. But it's one of these things that, again, is very fraught and it's very difficult to predict. Which, again, it's not unique to Hong Kong for history to make these. Right now, I think we all realize how often history, something comes in that just isn't what we were expecting at all. And
you mean something like a black swan? We seem to have had a couple of those recently in this country anyway, in most of the world. An interesting question came in. and I'll leave it, I'll ask Yangyang to start. Is it too optimistic to expect Hong Kongers to gather peacefully and protest ever again? And would China possibly send their army to crush such a protest?
It's interesting
Whichever one of you wants to answer that loaded question from one of our audience.
Oh, it's interesting you asked that, right? Because it kind of like alludes to what I mentioned in the beginning with regards to the legacy of Tiananmen, when there is so much how this has been flattened into a symbol that just becomes whether or not the army would be sent in, whether or not people would be able to gather peacefully to protest, and then having this kind of a very symbolic imagery of peaceful protesters against militarized state tools of violence, right? And is that a particularly interesting or important question to ask? In an era of COVID-19, right, it is raising these challenges that for people who are activists, who are organizers, and also for academics to think about what is on social organizing and political organizing in a pandemic era when physical congregation is not safe, and how whether or not there are things that can happen in the digital space, where there are things that can happen in the court or the ballot boxes. And so these are whether there are things that can happen in literature and in academia, in arts. And so this is where we need our collective imagination. I don't doubt that the people of Hong Kong have that imagination and have that resolve if health and other conditions allow. I do feel that these large protests could very well happen again, but that's not the only thing we should focus on. And similarly, whether or not the Chinese government will send in armies to crush it down, I think that question is actually not particularly interesting or relevant, because the Chinese government has been crushing down on freedoms in Hong Kong as well as in China, and as well as in the overseas diaspora communities in many ways that are not visible, that you cannot point to a physical symbol of a weapon. And so these are the things that we should think about and keep in mind, and not wait for some moment of tanks on the streets as some kind of marker that is when we need to do something different. No, the work is in every day, and the imagination is in every moment.
Very good.
Wow.
Now, that's awesome. I really appreciate that. Now, here's a question that just came in, and it says, so far, neither speaker has mentioned President Xi. Is he the main culprit here, and is there now a new cult of personality being created in China? I'll let whoever wants to answer that one.
I'm happy to jump in on that.
Okay.
My own sense is that a trend toward tightening of control began before President Xi, actually, and I call him Communist Party head Xi Jinping, because he's also president, but his power really comes from running the party. He became head of the party in late 2012 and then became president in 2013. And now he has so many titles that Jeremy Barmay, a wonderful New Zealand-based academic, says we should just call him chairman of everything rather than trying to keep track of all the titles he has. But a trend toward tightening began before he took power, but then it exacerbated after he took power. And so clearly his desire for control, and he's got more of a he's more of a strongman, charismatic leader than his predecessor. All of these trends have gotten worse since he took power, and not just Hong Kong, but also the terrible situation with camps in which Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities are have been disappeared into in Xinjiang and other places tightening control. We don't hear that much about Tibet these days, but human rights abuses there are terrible still. And it's just that Xinjiang has replaced Tibet as the place that gets a little bit more attention, but both have been under horrific forms of repression. So Xi Jinping is a big part of it. He certainly has been more concerned with, there's been more attention to treating it as subversive to make fun of him, or there have been more calls for expressions of loyalty to him. He's a stronger kind of authoritarian leader, but I do think the trends were underway before then. And the first significant protest in Hong Kong in the recent past was in the middle of 2012, right before she took power. when they were trying to bring in national education, more mainland-style patriotic education to Hong Kong, which would, among other things, have meant, cycling back to the Tiananmen thing, that you wouldn't be able to teach about Tiananmen differently in Hong Kong than you can in the mainland. And there were student-led protests then, including by a young teenager at that point, Joshua Wong, who then became globally famous later, to push back against that. But that was a sign that the screws were beginning to tighten on Hong Kong, as they had in other places before Xi, but Xi has sped it up. And I just want to cycle back to one other thing, which is that what happens in China doesn't happen in a vacuum. What's happening in other places affects it, both with Hong Kong and other places. So for example, on today, June 4th in Hong Kong, the police didn't turn out in riot gear to the vigil in Victoria Park, even though Victoria Park, the vigil had been not authorized. It was going to be an illegal event. There were a lot of police out, but there wasn't the kind of massive show of really intense force that there might have been. And one reason, I think, was simply that the Beijing official media and the Hong Kong official media at the moment wants the world to think of the US as the place where the focus on that kind of police action. So that's a kind of check on it. And in general, there's been an intentional, I think, effort to not have the kinds of photographs that will outrage the world the way the Tiananmen protests did. The power of individual images and specific martyrs, but also just an iconic photo, is something the Chinese Communist Party realizes. They know how powerful the Tank Man image was, and they've tried very hard to avoid those kinds of easily recognizable symbols taking place. So the human rights abuses in Xinjiang, also they've gone to great lengths to try to prevent there from being the kinds of photographs that could galvanize world opinion and world anger. There are stories, there are details, there are satellite images of how big the camps are, but those somehow don't have the emotional power. And I think it's really important how powerful these simple single images can sometimes be. In the US in 1970, it just was the 50th anniversary of the Kent State massacre. And one reason, there were 4 people killed in Ohio. And one reason Kent State became remembered as much as it was that there were very powerful iconic photos, including of a young woman crying over a dead body, and also of white youth putting flowers in the guns of National Guard rifles. And these became photographs that somehow summed up the moment very, very well. There was another killing on a campus, so I think it's very important to remember, a few days later at Jackson State, and there were 2 people killed rather than 4. They were Black. That has largely been forgotten in the American memory, in part because there weren't in part because of race and the differing valuing of Black and white bodies, but in part because of iconic images not taking hold. In China in 1989, there was a second massacre after the Beijing one in the city of Chengdu. Fewer people were killed in that massacre, but it's almost been completely forgotten outside of China. In part because the international press wasn't there. There weren't the same kinds of images. There wasn't the same kind of simple story that could be connected with a single image. So I think in Hong Kong, there's been a lot of brutality against the protesters, but there have been efforts to try to minimize a replica of anything that would once again make people have something to fix on in quite the way that the Tank Man and Tiananmen has given the world.
We're coming up on our hour that we have, and I've got there's 2 more questions.
Okay.
And I've got one for you, Yangyang. What's the best option for the US regarding China's actions in Hong Kong? What would be the most effective way in a utopian world for us to respond to that? From your perspective, having grown up in the mainland and lived in the West?
I think I'll take that this is a question that is asked as what we can do as individuals, not necessarily from the US government, because I think it's always a difficult bargain when it comes from state action, because states take action based on state interests. And the US government certainly would not place the well-being of the people of Hong Kong anywhere near, let alone at the same level or above its own interests. And so I think as individuals, this is a very difficult question. And I think one thing that we have seen the struggles with this global rise of ethno-authoritarianism and xenophobia and other kinds of divisions, and this retreat of democracy and freedom globally, is how people in relative freedom have overestimated their resolve but underestimated their power. So I think what every individual can do is to really reflect themselves and think about their role, right? What Hannah Arendt said at the beginning of The Human Condition is, I just want everyone to think about their own actions. And I think that is the first and most important thing to do. What is our own complicity in an unjust system? When we do work, when we buy merchandise, when we do business, when we, as scientists, as academics, when we take funding from the state, how any of these little actions may be contributing to state violence, may be enforcing systems of injustice. And I think that is the action that people anywhere should be taking. And only in that collective effort, in that collective awareness, would we be able to come to a place where our collective imagination can be able to not create a free and democratic future for Hong Kong, which is still the responsibility and the work of the people of Hong Kong, but also for China and for people anywhere, including here in the United States.
Well, that's another amazing answer. We have thousands of questions, literally, it looks like, but we're coming up on our hour, and so I'm going to end it with you, Jeff, and ask you this really simple question and give you about 3 minutes to answer. What do you see in your crystal ball on where Hong Kong will be in 10 years?
So it's funny you should mention 10 years, because there's a very popular film in Hong Kong called 10 Years. In 2015, people imagined 5 filmmakers imagine what Hong Kong would be like 10 years in the future. And they have very dark dystopian fears. And then people have been saying, actually, those things have begun to happen much more quickly than 10 years.
Oh.
So I say in a double sense, I'd say I see the odds are stacked against those fighting to preserve Hong Kong's differences. But Hong Kong has always surprised us, and history often surprises us. So I would see that 10 years from now, the likely scenario would seem to be kind of rationally tightening control, less and less difference between life in Hong Kong and life in a mainland city. The main option for things getting better would be a change in Beijing, which needs to happen. And I think a lot about the Soviet Union situation. In the middle of the 1980s, if you asked a very smart expert, somebody who knew all the data, if they looked at East Germany, say, in 1986 and said, what will this be like in 1996? They'd probably say, well, not much difference. It would still be a controlled place. It would still be that. And then you had complete change in Germany, and things surprised. And things could have gone either way in 1989 in a place like Germany, but in part because Gorbachev was a different kind of leader in Moscow. So I don't see Xi Jinping being replaced by a more liberalizing figure. I think that would change things, though, enormously for Hong Kong if it did happen. I think also Hong Kong is now settling into a kind of anti-colonial struggle. Beijing is like a colonial power, and anti-colonial struggles take a very long time. And they often seem like there's no way they'll succeed until they finally do, if they do. So I think I feel very distressed. I don't see an easy, hopeful scenario for Hong Kong, but I also don't want to count it out, because too often people have counted it out. And also there is this kind of dynamic of anti-colonial struggles that can be very long, protracted, and have many dark periods, but sometimes, against all odds, do manage to win.
Because we don't really know what's coming next, do we? That's been proven to us very much so in the last 3 or 4 months. Well, we could go on for hours, but we're right on our time. So I want to thank both of you for sharing your experience and knowledge and really amazing viewpoints. And I want to suggest to the audience that you get Dr. Wasserstrom's book, Vigil, Hong Kong on the Brink. It's utterly amazing knowledge in there. And right now I'm going to call on our current chair of the World Affairs Council of Orange County, Nora Valenzuela, for a few closing comments. Nora?
Thank you very much, Bill. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I'm having video problems. I apologize for that. And I just had a text from one of our audience who said, is it because you didn't have a haircut? No, I did have a. Yeah, our trustees do have my cell number, so they've been teasing me and texting me about that. I really wish to thank our program committee and also Bill as our moderator today, and of course our distinguished panel, Professor and also Dr. Cheng. We strive to deliver nonpartisan programs for public education by subject matter experts. And I'm always excited when our subject matter experts come from the academia rather than political offices. Because I feel that their perspective is focusing on facts, representing based on their knowledge and the collective consciousness of the arena that they are representing. So I must say the two of you certainly demonstrated that today, and I'm immensely grateful for that. I had the pleasure of traveling to Hong Kong from back in the 1989 to 1993, every year in January for conventions. I used to do consulting after I left Hewlett Packard. And I must say it was an amazing experience, but I did recognize toward the end that the cultural integration was beginning to bring a challenge into the society. The communication, that cosmopolitan arena was beginning to get impacted. So like everywhere else, including our country today, we're all seeing that challenges. I'd like to thank all of our audience, participants, our guests and members. Please look for our weekly broadcasts and also upcoming events in June and July. And as my last wish, I hope that our collective consciousness will bring our nations and people of the world together, recognizing that anytime there is a small problem in one part of the world, will impact the whole world, including what happened in our country last week, an action of one individual and 3 bystanders or witnesses cause a major disruption in our country. So we need to take individual responsibility to educate ourselves and be knowledgeable. And I agree with Dr. Cheng that the state actions do not always represent the people's interests and perhaps the state interests. So as people, we have responsibility to learn, and we're here at the World Affairs Council to be a small component of that and help educate the public. I thank our distinguished speakers again. I hope you come back and join us, and I would have the pleasure of meeting you in person. It's been an honor. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Nora. I want to say thanks to Yangyang and Jeff for all the time they've dedicated to this, because we've spent a lot of time working on this, and I really appreciate you doing that. It's the knowledge and experience and what you've told today, most people in the world would never know about.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to be part of this.
Yes, thank you so much. It was wonderful.
The honor is all mine. Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right, everyone be
Goodbye,
safe.
everybody, and thank you for participating.
Thank you. We had people saying goodbye from Europe, so.
All over the place, yeah.
Yes, wonderful, wonderful. We had
Okay.
a big international audience. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks.